Naturally, the U.S. refuses to attend a conference that addresses colonialism and racism. In more uplifting news, the world became a slightly brighter place with the death of Colin Powell. Not only has the U.S. decided to boycott the Durban conference that is held on racism and colonialism, they have voted against making food a human right and voted against the Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. So I'll wait for the neoliberals to explain to me how America is a democracy while it continues to oppress its own people in broad daylight in the UN. Pandora Papers. The leak contains over 11.9 million documents maintained by trusts. Western countries are boycotting the Durban conference because it addresses Zionism and apartheid. The US, France, Canada, Israel, and the UK have all decided not to attend the Durban conference. The first conference was held in 2001 in South Africa. It is to address colonialism and racism. So naturally, Western countries are throwing a temper tantrum and are boycotting the conference because it addresses Zionism and racism in Palestine. Specifically, they have issue with its stance on Zionism. And because Western countries always side with Israel, they are boycotting the conference. They claim the conference is anti-Semitic because it acknowledges Israel has stolen land from Palestinians. The Israeli government also does not allow the Palestinians to form their own military and controls all trade into occupied territories. If you are voting the same way as the US, then you may want to reevaluate your decision because the US has also voted against the right to food in 2005, and also later the US voted against the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Thursday, September 13th, 2007, the UN adopted what is the most comprehensive declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. Quote, it establishes the universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world, and it elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of Indigenous peoples. Of the 144 countries that supported the declaration, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were the only countries to vote against the declaration. On the topic of Indigenous rights, Indigenous leaders occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the first time since the 70s. 55 people were beaten, tased, and arrested for protesting fossil fuels. The last time the Bureau of Indian Affairs was occupied was March 16, 1970, in Littleton, Colorado. The demands of Indigenous leaders were abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, restoration of 110 million acres of stolen land, bring home children buried at residential schools, restoration of treaty making, establishment of a treaty commission to make new treaties, land back, water back, honor treaties, No new leases for oil and gas or extractive industry on public lands. Free, prior, and informed consent. Reclaim and affirm health, housing, employment, economic development, and education for all Indigenous people. Repeal of state jurisdiction on Native nations. And federal protection for offenses against Indians. In 2007, they voted against the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And in 2005, the U.S. was the only country in the UN to vote against the resolution that food should be made a right. Just some statistics on hunger in the U.S. 1 in 6 children go hungry in the U.S. 13 million children experience hunger. And 25% of households with children are food insecure. So it's no wonder that they voted against the resolution to make food a right. In more uplifting news, the world became a slightly brighter place with the death of Colin Powell. In 1991, after the US bombed a baby formula factory, quote, "It was not an infant formula factory. It was a biological weapons facility. Of that we are sure." And you can take his word on it because he also knew that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, dragging us into a $2 trillion war. In 1968, he also wrote the official report on the My Lai massacre, where he whitewashed U.S. war crimes. He would later go on to lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, yet again helping America escape accountability for war crimes it committed. If Biden's been good at one thing, it's been signing contracts for fracking and drilling and funding the police. Through the Pentagon's 1033 program, police departments received over $1.5 billion in military equipment. Since Biden has been in office, he has given $1.2 billion to police departments. Pandora Papers. 600 journalists around the world worked with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists on a leak of tax havens used by celebrities, prime ministers, politicians, presidents, and oligarchs. Quote, "The investigation identified 206 US-based trusts holding combined assets worth more than $1 billion, including nearly 30 trusts that held assets linked to people or companies accused of fraud, bribery, or human rights abuses." The investigation identified 206 US-based trusts holding combined assets worth more than $1 billion, including nearly 30 trusts that held assets linked to people or companies accused of fraud, bribery, or human rights abuses. The leak contains over 11.9 million documents maintained by trusts. Alaska, Delaware, Nevada, and South Dakota were among states that permitted trust loopholes. In South Dakota alone, over $360 million in assets are maintained by trusts. Central Romana Corp is among one of the companies accused of human rights abuses and exploiting workers. It is based in the Dominican Republic and was led by Carlos Morales Trascano. $14 million in profits were put into a trust with Trident in Sioux Falls in 2019. Lawyer John Blattmacher helped America eliminate limitations on trusts in the 1980s. He helped make it possible for trusts to be passed down from generation to generation with little to no tax obligation. Blattmacher also wanted to protect trusts from future claims and creditors, a practice already implemented in the Cook Islands and Belize. In 1997, after Blackamer helped write legislation on trusts, he launched his own trust, Peak Trust Co. Another of Trident's clients was Jose Pepe Anbar, who kept $100 million with the company. In 2004, an investigation found he sold drugs in the States and laundered money. He was forced to forfeit $20 million. Of the other world leaders and heads of state who were implicated in the Pandora Papers, King Abdullah II of Jordan, Prime Minister Andrei Babis of the Czech Republic, President Ali Bongo of Gabon, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, surprise, surprise, associate of Putin Svetlana Krivgonik, Princess Lola Hasna of Morocco, President Sebastian Pineda of Chile, former Prime Minister Aris Ali of Mozambique, former Prime Minister Sheikh Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, former President Cesar Guerra of Colombia, former President Alfredo Cristiani of El Salvador, Member of Parliament Nir Barkat of Israel, Minister of Finance Wopke Hoekstra of the Netherlands, and former IMF chief Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Interesting how the US was left out of this leak. There was the FinCEN leak. Before that, there was the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers. All of these documents that were made public that proved politicians are above the law and they take advantage of tax loopholes and will embezzle and hoard their wealth for their own, knowing full and well that they have citizens who live in poverty, that they have generations of people who live in their country who cannot escape poverty, yet they're using trust loopholes and tax loopholes, and they do not feel beholden to the people that they govern. The laws are for thee, not for me. They're never held accountable for their war crimes or financial crimes, and their greed is just to be expected of them.